Gideon Flint had a simple rule that had kept him alive for 15 long years out here on this lonely patch of dirt. When strangers came knocking on his cabin door, he would pretend to sleep, and then he would listen. You see, a man shows his true colors when he thinks no one can hear him. It was a test, and it had never failed. Most folks, drifters or lost travelers, would reveal their intentions within an hour. They'd talk about the silver he might have stashed away, the food in his pantry, or worse. Every single time, their whispers gave them away, and Gideon, lying perfectly still on his cot, would be ready for them. But tonight was different. Tonight, something was deeply, terribly wrong. The two Apache sisters who had appeared at his doorstep just as the sun bled out across the prairie, they were different. They claimed they needed shelter from a storm that was brewing, a big one he could feel in his bones. But they had been whispering for 3 straight hours now. 3 hours. No one had ever whispered for 3 hours. Gideon lay frozen on the hard wooden cot, his breathing so slow and shallow it was almost non-existent. He strained his ears, listening through the thin, splintered wall that separated his small sleeping space from the main room. The older sister's voice was a low, careful murmur, each word chosen with precision. The younger one answered in short, urgent bursts, her voice tight, with an emotion he couldn't quite place. They weren't speaking English. And it wasn't a dialect he recognized from his time trading with the local tribes. It was something older, something more hidden. And here's the thing that made the hair on his arms stand up. Somehow, impossibly, he understood every single word. That should have been his first warning, the first sign that this night wasn't just another test of survival, but a reckoning. A sign that the past he had killed and buried was about to claw its way out of the grave. Then, the older sister said something that turned his blood to ice water. She had said a name that no living person should know. The name of the man he used to be, 15 years ago, before he burned that life to the ground and scattered the ashes. But it got worse. When the younger sister replied, Gideon's carefully constructed world began to shatter. They weren't just talking about his past, they were talking about something specific, something he had done, an act of cowardice he had convinced himself was forgotten by the world, washed away by time and distance. As their hushed, impossible conversation continued, one terrible truth became crystal clear. These weren't strangers seeking shelter from a storm. The storm was a lie. They had come here specifically for him. The storm had been a monster, gathering its strength all afternoon. Gideon Flint knew storms. He could read their language in the heavy, humid weight of the air. He could see it in the way his few cattle huddled together by the eastern fence, their bodies turned against a wind that hadn't even arrived yet. He saw it in the bruised purple and angry gray of the clouds rolling in low and fast across the endless prairie. This one, he knew, would rage all through the night. So when the two Apache women materialized out of the dusk, just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, a knot tightened in his gut. The older one stood tall, her posture straight and proud, despite the deep exhaustion etched into the lines around her dark, piercing eyes. The younger sister, however, leaned heavily against the porch post, her face pale, clearly favoring her left leg. Both wore simple, travel-worn dresses that had seen hundreds of miles of dust and hardship. Their long, jet-black hair was unbound, hanging loose and damp around their shoulders. "Please," the older woman said. Her English was careful, precise, but clear. "My sister, she needs shelter, just for the night." Gideon's hand stayed firm on the door frame, his body blocking the entrance. 15 years of isolation had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and every one of those instincts was screaming at him now. Something about these two women felt wrong. It was too perfect, too convenient. Their arrival, timed exactly with the storm, felt like a scene from a play. "There's a town 12 miles south," he said, his voice a low gravel. He watched their faces, searching for a flicker of deception. They've got a proper inn there. A doctor, too, if she needs one. The younger sister looked up at him then, and Gideon saw something that made him pause. There was pain in her eyes, yes, a deep and genuine pain. But underneath it, for just a fraction of a second, he saw a flash of something else. Recognition. It was as if she'd seen him before, as if she knew him. That was impossible. He would have remembered a face like hers. He would have remembered those eyes. The older woman pressed, her voice calm but insistent. "We cannot travel further in this weather. My sister, she was injured yesterday. A fall from her horse. Please, we ask only for a spot by your fire." As if on cue, a jagged fork of lightning split the sky behind them, illuminating their weary faces in a stark, ghostly light. A deafening crack of thunder followed, and the rain, which had been a mere sprinkle, unleashed itself in a torrential downpour. Gideon's practical side warred with a lifetime of hard-earned caution. Leaving them out in this tempest was a death sentence, but letting them in felt like a different kind of death sentence, one he couldn't yet understand. He looked at the younger sister again. Her face was turned down, her hair hiding her expression. But something about the set of her jaw, the way she held herself even in her pain, reminded him of someone from that other life. Someone he had tried, with every fiber of his being, to forget. Against every instinct, against his better judgment, he stepped aside. "You can sleep by the fire," he grunted, gesturing with his chin toward the small, Spartan common room. "But I rise before the sun. You'll need to be gone by then." "Of course," the older woman replied, her voice smooth as river stone. But there was an undertone to her words, a quiet certainty that suggested she had absolutely no intention of leaving so soon. As they settled themselves on the floor near the small, crackling fireplace, Gideon retreated to his cot in the back room. The thin wooden wall was all that separated them. He lay down, fully clothed, his worn leather boots still on his feet. This was his test. He closed his eyes. In an hour, maybe two, their guard would drop. They would whisper their true purpose. They always did. But as he slowed his breathing, mimicking the deep, even rhythm of sleep, Gideon couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that he had it all backward. Tonight, he wasn't the one testing them. Tonight, he was the one being tested. The first whisper from the younger sister hit him like a physical blow. It was in that strange yet familiar Apache dialect, and the words sliced right through his feigned sleep. Because somehow, against all logic, he understood them perfectly. "Sister," she had said, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "We found him." Gideon's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but he forced his body to remain perfectly, unnaturally still. The language, the words, they were coming back to him now, bubbling up from a deep, dark well in his memory he had sealed shut 15 years ago. He had spent 3 years living among the Apache after his own family was wiped out by cholera. He'd learned their language, their ways, their customs. He had become one of them, until everything went wrong, until the day he was forced to become someone else entirely. The older sister responded in a low, urgent tone. "Ayana, be quiet. He may understand our words." "He is asleep, Kaya. Look at his breathing. It is deep and slow." But Gideon wasn't asleep. Far from it. Every muscle in his body was coiled as tight as a spring trap as he listened to them discuss him, dissect him, in the language he had once spoken as fluently as English. The language he had sworn to himself he would never, ever use again. 15 winters have passed, the younger one, Ayana, continued. He looks older, harder. The world has not been kind to him. The scar is still there, the older sister, Kaya, whispered back. Above his left eye. It is him. There is no doubt. Gideon's hand instinctively twitched, wanting to move toward the thin white line that cut a path through his eyebrow. It was a permanent reminder of the day his old life ended and this new, empty one began. Very few people in this world knew the story of that scar. Even fewer who had seen him get it were still drawing breath. "What if he does not remember us?" Kaya asked, a note of worry in her voice. "He remembers," Ayanna replied, her tone filled with a chilling certainty. "The question is whether he will listen to us." A pause. The fire crackled in the other room. "And if he refuses?" Kaya's voice was barely a breath. "Then we take what we came for," Ayanna said, "and we leave." Gideon's mind raced. Take what? What could they possibly want from him? He had nothing of value. A few cattle, a small cabin, a life built on being invisible. "But sister," Kaya's voice dropped so low that Gideon had to strain to hear her over the storm. "If what grandmother told us is true, if he truly was the one who—" Her voice faltered. "If he was the one who saved our brother that day, then he deserves to know the truth about what happened after." His breath caught in his throat. Their brother. He remembered now. It was a memory buried under years of guilt and fear. A young Apache boy, maybe 8 years old, skinny and fearless, caught in a flash flood down by the creek. Gideon had been there. He'd pulled the boy from the churning, muddy water, carried his limp body back to the village, and saved his life. But that was years before he left the Apache lands. Years before the incident that had forced him to run, to change his name, to become this ghost of a man. "The truth will destroy him," Kaya said softly, her words filled with a strange kind of pity. "Perhaps," Ayanna replied, "but the lie has already destroyed someone else." The sisters fell silent then. The only sounds were the rain on the roof and the frantic beating of Gideon's own heart. He was trapped, caught between a desperate, burning curiosity and a growing, suffocating dread. What truth? What lie? And why now? Why, after all these years, had they tracked him to this forgotten corner of the world? A loud clap of thunder rolled across the prairie, shaking the small cabin to its foundations. In the sudden, ringing quiet that followed, Gideon heard a sound that chilled him to the bone. One of the sisters was crying, but it wasn't the sound of simple sadness. It was the choked, ragged sound of someone who had been carrying a terrible, crushing burden for far too long. The sound of someone who had finally found the one person in the world who might be able to help them set it down. "Tomorrow," Ayanna whispered, her voice fierce and determined. "When the storm ends, we tell him everything." "What if he runs again?" Kaya asked. "Then we follow him. We have waited too long for this. Our brother deserves justice, even if it comes 15 years too late." The word justice hung in the air between the two rooms, like smoke from a dying fire. Gideon lay frozen on his cot, his mind a whirlwind, racing backward through 15 years of carefully constructed walls and buried memories. Their brother, the boy from the flood. But what in God's name did justice have to do with a rescue? Unless it wasn't about the rescue at all. "I still see his face in my dreams," Kaya whispered, her voice thick with an ancient, unprocessed grief. "Little Takakota. He was so proud when he learned to track deer with the older boys, so excited to prove himself a man." Takakota. The name hit Gideon like a fist to the stomach, a punch that knocked the wind out of him and sent him tumbling back in time. He remembered now, not just the rescue of the small boy, but what came after. The boy who had grown into a proud, reckless young man. The young man who had been there on that terrible day. The day when everything went wrong. "Tell me again what the traitor said," Ayanna murmured, her voice hard as flint. "The one who told us where to find this man." "He said there was a witness," Kaya recited, as if from memory. "Someone who saw what really happened at the canyon. Someone who could prove that Takakota did not start the fight that got him killed." Gideon's throat constricted. The canyon, the fight, the day that had haunted his nightmares for 15 long years. The day he had been forced to make an impossible choice: stay and tell the truth, or run and save his own life. He had chosen to run. The traitor said this man, this Gideon Flint, was there when our brother died, Kaya continued, her voice rising with anger. He knows who really fired the first shot. But why did he not come forward? Why did he not speak for Takakota when the soldiers came asking their questions? Maybe he was afraid, Ayana offered, though she didn't sound convinced. Maybe he thought no one would believe him, an outsider against 5 of them. Or maybe, Kaya's voice turned to steel, he was the one who killed our brother. The accusation struck Gideon with the force of a physical blow. It was so wrong, so grotesquely twisted, that he almost sat up and shouted. They thought he was the killer. That's why they were here. They hadn't tracked him down for answers. They'd tracked him down for revenge. They believed he had murdered Takakota. The irony was a bitter pill, choking him. They wanted justice for their brother's death. And in their search, they had found the one man who had desperately, frantically tried to prevent it. We must be careful, Ayana warned. If he is guilty, if he knows we suspect him, then why would he let us inside? Why give shelter to his accusers? Perhaps he feels the weight of his guilt, Kaya suggested. Or perhaps he wants to know what we know before he decides what to do with us. Gideon's hands, hidden beneath his thin blanket, clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. The terrible weight of that day, the memory he had fought so hard to suppress, came flooding back with brutal, unforgiving clarity. The argument between Takakota and the group of rough-looking drifters. The insults that had quickly escalated into threats. The awful, heart-stopping moment when Gideon saw one of the drifters, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes, reach for the gun on his hip. He'd shouted a warning, he'd tried, but it was too late. By the time the acrid blue smoke cleared, young Takakota lay bleeding in the Red Canyon dirt, and the drifters were already concocting their story of self-defense. But only Gideon had seen the truth. Only he knew that Takakota had never drawn his weapon. He had died with his hands empty. Tomorrow we ask him directly, Ayana decided, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. We will tell him that we know he was there. We will demand the truth. And if he lies, she paused. If he lies, then we will make him understand that some debts must be paid, no matter how much time has passed. The sisters fell quiet after that, and Gideon could hear the soft sounds of them moving about, preparing for sleep. His mind, however, was a churning, chaotic mess. He was reeling from the weight of what he had learned. They weren't here to thank him for saving their brother as a boy. They were here because they believed he had killed that same brother as a man. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, the thunder rumbling further and further away. But inside the small, dark cabin, a different, more violent tempest was just beginning to build. And Gideon had a sickening feeling that tomorrow, when the truth finally came roaring out, none of them would survive it. Sleep was an impossibility. Gideon lay awake, listening to the gradual quieting of the storm and the soft, even breathing of the 2 women in the next room. Every agonizing detail of that day, 15 years ago, played over and over in his mind, with a cruel, vivid clarity. He'd been trading horses with a few Apache families camped near Silver Canyon when the trouble started. Takakota, now 19 years old and full of a young man's fire, eager to prove himself a warrior in the eyes of his elders, had ridden into their camp in a cloud of dust. His eyes were blazing with righteous anger. A group of drifters, he announced, was stealing cattle from Apache lands, not half a day's ride from where they sat. The boy had wanted to confront them alone. He was young and proud and foolish, but Gideon, who was older and knew the kind of casual violence men in this territory were capable of, had insisted on coming along. He felt a sense of responsibility for the boy he'd once pulled from a raging river. They'd found the drifters just as Takakota had said, down in the dusty, sun-baked basin of Silver Canyon. There were 5 of them, rough, hard-bitten men with mean faces, driving a small herd of stolen cattle marked with the Apache clan's brand. What should have been a simple, tense confrontation turned ugly, fast. The leader of the drifters, a big, scarred man named Dutch Morrison, had just laughed in Takakota's face when the young man demanded they return the animals. "An Indian boy thinks he can tell white men what to do," Morrison had sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt near Takakota's feet. His men had chuckled, their hands hovering near their guns. Takakota's hand had instinctively moved to the hilt of his knife, his face a mask of fury. But he hadn't drawn it. Gideon remembered that with perfect, unshakable clarity. The young man had kept his weapons sheathed. He was trying to solve the problem with words first, with honor, just as his grandfather, the tribe's elder, had taught him. But Morrison and his men had no interest in words. They had no interest in honor. Gideon had seen it happen in slow motion. Morrison's eyes, cold and empty as a snake's, the slight tensing of his shoulders, the way his hand slowly, deliberately, inched toward the butt of his pistol. Gideon had opened his mouth to shout a warning, to scream Takakota's name. In that split second before the world exploded in fire and noise, their eyes had met, Morrison's and Gideon's, and Morrison had smiled, a thin, cruel smile. And in that moment, Gideon knew. This wasn't a fight. It was a murder. The shot came so fast, a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. It was too fast for Takakota to even react. The young Apache warrior fell to the ground without ever drawing a weapon, a look of shocked surprise on his face. When the soldiers arrived an hour later to investigate the gunshot, Morrison and his men had their story ready. They claimed self-defense, said the savage had attacked them first, that they'd only fired to protect their own lives. The other 4 drifters backed his story without hesitation. It was the word of 5 white men against a dead Apache. The investigation barely lasted an hour before it was closed. But there had been another witness. Gideon had seen everything. He'd been hidden behind a large rock outcropping, where he'd gone to get a better look at the stolen cattle. And Morrison knew he was there. After the soldiers left, after Takakota's body had been carried away by his grieving family, the drifter had found him. "You seem like a smart man," Morrison had said, his gun still smoking in his hand, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. "Smart enough to know that sometimes the truth ain't worth dying for." The threat was unmistakable. Stay silent, or you'll join Takakota in the ground. And Gideon, terrified and alone, had made his choice, a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had nodded. He had left the Apache lands that very night, without a word of goodbye to the people who had taken him in. He never spoke Takakota's name again. For 15 years he had told himself he'd had no other choice. It was 5 armed men against 1. He would have died for nothing. His testimony wouldn't have changed a thing. But lying here now, in the dark, listening to the quiet, sleeping grief of Takakota's sisters just a few feet away, Gideon finally understood the true, crushing cost of his cowardice. Outside, the storm was breaking apart, the sky was beginning to clear, but inside his chest, a different kind of weather was building, a storm of shame and regret that had been brewing for 15 years. The sisters wanted justice for their brother, and they deserved the truth. But the truth wouldn't just destroy Morrison. It would destroy Gideon too, because there was one more detail. One last, damning secret from that day that he had never told anyone, a secret he had barely allowed himself to remember, a secret that made his silence so much worse than simple fear. Morrison hadn't just threatened him. The drifter had offered him a partnership, a cut of every herd they stole, every job they pulled. Easy money, Morrison had called it, for the simple price of keeping his mouth shut about what he'd seen at the canyon. And Gideon, in his fear and his desperation to disappear, to start a new life somewhere far away from the blood and the memories. He had said yes. He had taken the money. As the first hint of dawn began to creep through the small cabin window, and he heard the first soft sounds of the sisters beginning to stir, Gideon realized that his simple test had failed completely. He had learned their true intentions, yes, but in doing so, he had discovered something far, far worse about himself. The man they had traveled all this way to find wasn't just a coward who had stood by and watched their brother die. He was an accomplice to murder. Dawn crept through the small window, painting the cabin walls in drab shades of gray. Gideon could hear the sisters moving about quietly in the main room, their whispers soft as they prepared for what they clearly believed would be a final, bloody confrontation. He could no longer bear the crushing weight of the lie, of pretending to sleep. With a groan, he slowly sat up on his cot, every muscle in his body aching with a tension that had been building for 15 years. He was done running. It was time to face the truth. "I know you're awake," a voice came from the next room. It was Ayanna, steady, calm, and sure. "We heard your breathing change an hour ago." Gideon's blood ran cold. They'd known. They had known he was listening. The entire conversation, every word about justice and revenge, every accusation. It had all been a performance. It was a trap designed to test him, just as he had tried to test them. The hunters had become the hunted. He had walked right into their snare. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him, and walked into the main room. The two sisters were waiting for him by the dying embers of the fire. In the pale, unforgiving morning light, he could see their family resemblance so clearly. They had their father's high cheekbones, their grandmother's fierce, intelligent eyes. These weren't the frightened, weary travelers they had pretended to be last night. These were warriors, and they were on a mission. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "That you were listening?" Kaya replied, her eyes never leaving his face. "Since the moment you lay down. Men who are truly asleep do not hold their breath when thunder strikes." "That's not what I meant," Gideon said, his gaze shifting to Ayanna. "We know," Ayanna said, taking a small step forward. Gideon saw her hand rest almost casually near the knife tucked into her belt. The message was clear. "The question is, Gideon Flint, what are you going to do about it?" For a long, silent moment, the three of them stared at each other across the small, claustrophobic room. Outside, the world was coming alive. Morning birds were beginning to sing in the rain-washed air. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick and heavy, suffocating with the weight of unspoken truths and 15 years of lies. "I didn't kill your brother," Gideon said finally, the words feeling small and inadequate. "But you know who did," Kaya accused, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Yes. And you said nothing," she pressed on. "For 15 years, you let his killer walk free. You let our family believe he died, starting a fight he was trying to prevent." Gideon's hands began to tremble as the full, monstrous scope of his guilt settled on him like a physical weight. "It wasn't that simple," he stammered. "It was exactly that simple." Ayanna's voice cut through his excuse like a blade. "A man murdered our brother in cold blood. You watched it happen, and then you chose to stay silent." "I chose to stay alive," he shot back, his voice cracking. "You chose money over justice." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. They knew. They knew about Morrison's payment. Somehow, impossibly, they knew everything. "How?" he whispered, his defenses crumbling. "Dutch Morrison got drunk in a trading post 3 years ago," Kaya said, her voice bitter with old pain. "He started bragging about how he'd once bought himself a witness to a murder, about how some coward named Gideon Flint took his silver in exchange for letting him get away with killing a young Apache warrior." The room spun around Gideon. Morrison. He was still alive, still out there, still telling the story, still poisoning the world with his lies. And now, these women, Takakota's own blood, knew the full, sickening extent of his betrayal. "Where is he?" Ayana demanded, her hand now gripping the hilt of her knife. "Tell us." "I don't know," Gideon said, shaking his head. "I swear to you I never saw him again after that day." "Liar!" Kaya hissed. "I swear it! I took the money and I ran. I never looked back." "You took money from our brother's killer," Kaya interrupted, stepping closer until she was only a few feet away. Her eyes were burning with a righteous fire. "Blood money. You became his partner in murder the very moment you accepted his payment." Gideon wanted to deny it. He wanted to scream, to try and explain the gut-wrenching fear and the desperate panic that had driven his choice that day. But looking into their faces, seeing the raw, unending pain that he had helped cause, he found he had no words left for excuses. There were none. "What do you want from me?" he asked instead, his voice barely a whisper. The two sisters exchanged a long, meaningful look, and Gideon saw something pass between them, a silent understanding that made his stomach drop to the floor. "We want you to help us find him," Ayana said quietly, her voice devoid of all emotion. "And then, we want you to watch him die." Gideon stared at the two women, his mind reeling from their demand. Help them find Morrison. Watch him die. After 15 years of running from his past, they were asking him to turn around and run straight into its gaping maw. "You're asking me to help you commit murder," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We are asking you to help us deliver justice," Ayana corrected him, her voice cold and precise. "There is a difference." "Not in the eyes of the law," he argued weakly. "The law had its chance 15 years ago," Kaya said, her voice dripping with bitterness. "The law chose to believe the lies of 5 white men over the truth. The law failed our brother. The law failed our family." Gideon couldn't argue with that. He understood their anger. He could feel a similar rage, long dormant, burning in his own chest. But what they were proposing was vigilantism. It would make them no better than Morrison himself. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "Then you will spend the rest of your short life looking over your shoulder," Ayana said simply, without a hint of theatrics. "Because we will tell everyone who you really are. We will go to every town, every trading post, every territory. We will tell the story of the man who took blood money to cover up the murder of an Apache boy. Your name will be poison." The threat was clear, and it was devastatingly effective. His new life, the quiet, anonymous existence he had so carefully built, would crumble to dust within months. No one would trade with him. No one would sell to him. No one would offer him work. He would become a pariah, a ghost, forced to keep running until he died alone and forgotten in some nameless ditch. "How did you find me?" he asked, stalling, trying to give his racing mind time to think, to find a way out of this impossible situation. "It took us 3 years," Kaya admitted, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "After we heard the story, we started following Morrison's trail. We went from trading post to saloon, listening to the drunken stories he left in his wake. He mentioned your name often. He always laughed about it, laughed about his business partner, who helped him get away with murder." "I was not his partner," Gideon growled. "You took his money. You kept his secret. You let him profit from our brother's death." Ayana's voice was as cold and sharp as a winter wind. "What would you call it?" The words hit home because they were true. For 15 agonizing years, Gideon had told himself a lie. He had been a victim of circumstance, a man with no choice. But sitting here now, in this cabin, facing the living, breathing consequences of his cowardice, he could no longer maintain the illusion. "Morrison spoke of you like you were friends," Kaya continued, twisting the knife. "He said you had been reliable, that you kept your word. He even said he knew where to find you, if he ever needed another favor." A chill, colder than any winter storm, ran down Gideon's spine. He knows where I am. For years, apparently, Ayanna confirmed. He's been keeping track of you, making sure his little investment stayed quiet. The horrifying implications crashed over Gideon like a tidal wave. Morrison hadn't just paid him and forgotten him. He had been watching him, monitoring his life, ensuring his silence, ready to eliminate him the second he became a threat. All these years, Gideon had thought he was hiding. He'd been a fool. He hadn't been in hiding. He'd been in a cage. "There's something else," Ayanna said, and the tone of her voice changed, carrying a new, darker note that made Gideon's stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. "Morrison is not just a simple cattle thief anymore. He has built himself a small empire. He has dozens of men working for him now. They steal livestock, they rob supply wagons, and they murder anyone who gets in their way." "How many other people has he killed since Takakota?" Kaya asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them like a ghost. How many deaths was Gideon responsible for? How many other families had Morrison destroyed while living free, all because of his silence, all because of his greed? "We tracked down some of the other drifters who were there that day," Ayanna continued, her eyes locked on Gideon's. "2 of them are dead now. Another one disappeared. But the 4th one, he told us something very interesting before we convinced him to talk." "What?" Gideon breathed. "Morrison has been planning something big. A robbery that will set him and his men up for life. And he wants his old, reliable partner to help him pull it off." Gideon felt the blood drain from his face. "What are you talking about?" "He's coming here, Gideon," Ayanna said, delivering the final, devastating blow. "Tomorrow, maybe the day after. He's coming to collect his business partner for one final job." The room seemed to tilt around him. Morrison, coming here. After 15 years of carefully maintained distance, the man who had ruined his life, the killer from his nightmares, was coming to drag him back into the darkness. "That's why we had to find you first," Kaya said, her voice suddenly softer. "Because when Dutch Morrison arrives, you are going to have to choose." "Choose what?" Gideon asked, his mind numb. "Whether you die as his partner," Ayanna said, her dark eyes boring into his, "or live as our ally." The sound reached them just before noon, the unmistakable rhythmic beat of approaching horses. 3 riders, moving at a slow, unhurried pace across the open prairie, heading directly for Gideon's homestead. Gideon peered through the small, grimy window. He could see them clearly now. Dutch Morrison was in the lead, sitting tall in his saddle. He was flanked by 2 younger men, their faces hard and emotionless, the dead eyes of professional killers. "Get in the back room," Gideon told the sisters, his voice an urgent, desperate whisper. "Stay quiet. No matter what you hear, you do not come out." "No," Ayanna said, her voice firm as bedrock. Her hand was already on the rifle she had leaned against the wall. "We have waited 15 years for this moment. We will not hide." "This isn't how it should happen," Gideon hissed. "Not like this. He has 2 men with him. It's a suicide mission." "Then how?" Kaya demanded, her face a mask of cold fury. "When Morrison rides away from here, how many more people will die because we waited for the right moment? How many more brothers? How many more sons?" Before Gideon could answer, a voice, loud and booming, echoed across the yard, shattering the tense silence. "Gideon Flint, get yourself out here, partner. We've got business to discuss." The word partner hit Gideon like a physical blow. Even after all these years, after everything, Morrison still considered him an ally, still expected his loyalty, his cooperation. The sheer, arrogant presumption of it was sickening. "Stay hidden," he whispered fiercely to the sisters, his eyes pleading with them. Then, taking a deep breath, he pushed the cabin door open and stepped out onto the porch, blinking in the bright midday sun. Morrison looked older, but he was no less dangerous. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and a network of new scars crisscrossed his weathered face. But his eyes held the same cold reptilian calculation that had terrified Gideon 15 years ago in that canyon. "Well, well," Morrison said, swinging down from his horse with a grunt. He swaggered toward the porch, a cruel smirk on his face. "You've done all right for yourself out here, Flint. A nice, quiet place to lay low. I approve." "What do you want, Dutch?" Gideon asked, keeping his voice even, his hands loose at his sides. "What I want," Morrison said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps, "is my old partner back. I've got a job that needs doing, a big one, and I need someone I can trust." Morrison's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Someone who knows how to keep his mouth shut when it counts. "I'm not your partner," Gideon said, his voice low and tight. "I never was." "Now, that's not how I remember it," Morrison chuckled, stepping closer. His hand rested casually on the butt of his gun. "I remember you taking my money real eager-like. I remember you disappearing that very night without a word to nobody. See, that's partnership behavior, Gideon. That was fear, not partnership. Call it what you want." Morrison shrugged. "Point is, you've been living this quiet little life for 15 years because of our arrangement. Now it's time to pay some of that debt back." Through the window behind him, Gideon caught a flicker of movement. The sisters. They were positioning themselves, getting ready. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the entire situation was a powder keg, and the fuse was burning short. "What kind of job?" he asked, trying to stall, to buy time, to think. "Supply wagon," Morrison said, his eyes glittering with greed. "Heading through Devil's Pass next week. Army payroll. Enough silver in that wagon to set us all up for life. But it's a tricky job. Needs careful planning. It needs a friendly face. Someone the soldiers might trust." He looked Gideon up and down. "Someone with a respectable reputation like you." "And if I refuse?" Morrison's expression darkened instantly. The friendly facade vanished, replaced by the cold-blooded killer underneath. "You know too much about my business to refuse, partner. You always have. That's why I kept track of you all these years. Insurance, you might call it." The threat hung in the air, as clear and sharp as a hangman's noose. Cooperate or die. But before Gideon could respond, before he could make a choice that would seal his fate, a new voice cut through the tense standoff like a razor. "Dutch Morrison." All three men spun around, their hands flying to their guns. Ayanna stood in the cabin doorway. She was holding her rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at Morrison's chest. Behind her, Kaya emerged from the shadows, a pistol held steady in each hand. Morrison's face went white with shock and disbelief as he stared at them. He recognized them. "No," he breathed, the color draining from his face. "It can't be." "Hello, Uncle," Ayanna said, her voice as steady and cold as a tombstone. "We've been looking for you." "Uncle." The word exploded in the silent yard. Morrison was their uncle. The recognition in his eyes, the sheer horror on his face, confirmed the impossible, sickening truth. These weren't just Takakota's sisters. They were Morrison's own nieces. The man hadn't just murdered a rival. He had murdered his own family. "You killed our brother," Kaya said, her voice trembling with 15 years of suppressed rage and grief. "Your own nephew." "Takakota was getting too bold," Morrison snarled, his shock giving way to a desperate, defensive anger. "He was always stirring up trouble with the other tribes, making it harder for honest men to do business. He would have gotten us all killed." "He was trying to protect our people from thieves like you," Ayanna shot back. "I was trying to survive," Morrison yelled. His hand moved toward his gun, but he froze when he saw both sisters tighten their grips on their weapons, their knuckles white. "You think I wanted it to happen? He was family." "Family does not steal from family," Ayanna said, her voice dripping with contempt. "And family does not murder family for profit." Morrison's two men, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, were reaching for their own weapons, and in that instant, Gideon Flint made his choice. After 15 years of running, of hiding, of drowning in cowardice, he finally found his courage. "Dutch Morrison murdered Takakota in cold blood," he said, his voice loud and clear, carrying across the yard. The words felt like liberation. The boy never drew his weapon. He never threatened anyone. Morrison shot him down like a dog, and then he paid me to keep quiet about it. "Shut your mouth, Flint!" Morrison screamed, his face turning purple with rage. "I watched him die," Gideon continued, taking a step forward, deliberately placing himself between Morrison and the sisters. "I watched you kill an unarmed boy, and I said nothing. But I'm saying something now." Morrison's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "You broke our deal!" "There was never any deal," Gideon said, the last of his fear burning away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "There was just a coward who was too afraid to speak the truth, until now." Morrison went for his gun, but Gideon was ready. He lunged forward, tackling the older man around the waist, driving him backward off the porch and into the dusty yard. They rolled and struggled in the dirt, a desperate, tangled mess of flailing limbs, each man fighting for control of Morrison's weapon. The two gunmen started to move forward to help their boss, but they stopped dead in their tracks, finding themselves staring down the unwavering barrels of the sisters' guns. They were smart enough to recognize a losing fight. Slowly, they raised their hands in surrender. Morrison, with a roar of effort, broke free from Gideon's grasp and scrambled to his feet. His gun was finally clear of its holster. He raised it, pointing it directly at Gideon's chest. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Ayanna's rifle spoke first. The single shot echoed across the vast, empty prairie. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of Dutch Morrison's chest. He staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He tried to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out as blood frothed from his lips. His eyes went dark and empty, and he crumpled to the ground in a heap. For a long, ringing moment, the four survivors stood in the sudden, shocking quiet, staring down at the body of the man who had poisoned so many lives for so long. "It's finished," Kaya said softly, her voice breaking with the weight of 15 years. Gideon looked at the sisters, at these two remarkable, unbreakable women who had crossed a continent, not for simple revenge, but for justice, for truth. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Ayanna replied, lowering her rifle, her eyes meeting his. "Now you live with the truth instead of running from it. And maybe, for a man like you, that's enough." They buried Morrison in an unmarked grave behind the cabin. His two men, eager to distance themselves from the crimes of their dead leader, rode away without a backward glance and were never seen again. As the sun set over the prairie, casting long shadows across the land, Gideon Flint finally felt the crushing weight of 15 years begin to lift from his shoulders. The sisters stayed for 3 more days, helping him set his small homestead in order. Before they left, riding east toward the lands of their people, Gideon gave them all the money he had saved and all the money Morrison had been carrying. It was blood money, but maybe, just maybe, it could be used to help rebuild some of what the killer had destroyed. He never saw them again, but he never forgot them either. And that night, for the first time in 15 years, Gideon Flint slept peacefully, without nightmares, all through the long, quiet night. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. We've got another story of justice and redemption in the Old West coming your way next week, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep these stories alive. Thanks for watching.